The Avengers vs. the Peter Factor by midnightwolf2192. Chapter 31. Field Trip Part 2. Ari was about to lead the group of teenagers into one of the labs when Peter's name was called loudly from down the hallway. The group stopped in their tracks, Flash grinning gleefully as Happy Hogan approached them angrily. Maybe Parker was getting thrown out for his bull. You know I'm on a field trip. I haven't even blown anything up yet, Peter protested weakly before Happy could say a word. The man stopped in front of his nephew and raised an eyebrow. Peter found his phone being thrust into his hands and he looked up at Happy with a raised eyebrow of his own. I'm on a field trip. No phones allowed. And that rule doesn't apply to you, Happy drawled. Kid, that thing has been vibrating non-stop since this morning. It's driving my team insane. There are no field phones allowed on the trip, Phillips interrupted as he stepped up to Happy and Peter. This time the man did indeed snatch the device from Peter's hand and slide it into his pocket. I will hold on to this. You may have it back once we are on the bus. Give the kid his phone right now. Happy's voice had become dangerous. Phillips stared at him in confusion, but didn't make a move as the man said, Give Pete his phone back, or I'll take it from you. John, give Mr. Parker his phone. Principal Marita ordered, flanking Peter's other side. Mr. Parker will leave it in his pocket for the duration of the tour. Won't he, Mr. Parker? Yes, sir, Peter replied, and Phillips reluctantly took the device out of his pocket. He placed it in Peter's hand, but glared at the teenager as he did so. Peter quickly silenced the notifications and slid the phone into his jeans. Peter will use it if required, Happy commented, and Marita looked at him. He won't use it for personal reasons, but he may need to answer questions from other scientists in the building. I trust this will be acceptable? Of course, Marita replied, and Happy nodded before he turned to Peter. I have also been instructed to tell you that your demon cat is in the timeout corner for trying to eat Boss's screwdrivers again. Blue will be joining you at some point once Boss has finished with her arm upgrades, and if Clint didn't tell you, the Barton children will be arriving tomorrow, and have demanded you take them to Coney Island. Happy explained, and Peter nodded. And now I'm done being a PA. I am only paid to babysit the boss, not you. Thanks, Uncle Happy, Peter said softly, and the man smiled at him before turning on his heel and walking back down the hallway. Ari got the group's attention again and indicated for them all to follow her. Alright guys, Ari said with an excited grin. The scientists in this lab are all affectionately known as the Science Children. This is the lab that both Peter and I work in, so we hope you enjoy your time in here. Just be careful. We work with a number of highly volatile chemicals and elements, and we'd hate for any of you to get hurt because you weren't following the already discussed lab rules. Ari swiped her card and the door opened with a gentle swoosh. Lola and Jeremy looked up from their computers and grinned at the group as they all crowded in. The two interns stood up and all approached the group, and Lola stepped right up to Peter and hugged him tightly. Welcome, guys, Lola said excitedly as she broke away from the blushing Peter. Hopefully Ari has explained the basics, so we can just jump in with the fun. Does anyone have any questions for us? Jeremy asked. Hands shot up around the room, and Jeremy pointed to Betty. As the interns fielded questions, Peter felt an arm loop through his. He looked over at Dakota with a grin. She had a manic look on her face, and Peter was concerned. What did you break? Peter asked, and the young woman laughed. Nothing yet, Dakota said with a smirk, and Peter rolled his eyes. Come with me. You need to see this. Peter turned to Principal Marita and caught his attention. The man moved across to him and nodded for him to speak. Sir, Dakota here has something to show me, Peter said before turning to her workstation. I'll just be over there. Is that all right? Yes, Pete. Thank you for asking, Principal Marita said, and Dakota dragged the team over to her desk. Look, Dakota said, pointing at a beaker that was bubbling away happily, and Peter grinned. You stabilized it! Peter cried excitedly, and Dakota nodded. Peter hugged the girl tightly and smiled. Well done, Dakota! That's amazing! That's the first time you've ever touched a girl, Parker. Flash's voice sounded, and Peter tensed. Dakota growled under her breath, and Peter felt her tense. The group's over here, Parker. Just 'cause you've got these people convinced you're better than you are, doesn't mean that you are. Now, wait a minute, Cotus started, but Principal Marita approached with a frown on his face. Mr. Thompson, what are you doing here? Marita demanded, and Flash turned. Why have you moved away from the group? There are some interesting questions being asked which you should be listening to. But Parker isn't paying attention. Flash whined, and Marita's frown deepened. Mr. Parker already asked me if he could leave the group. Besides, his colleagues requested his presence. You are neither a colleague, nor did you ask permission. Get back to the group now. Marita replied firmly. Don't make me give you another warning. Flash turned to the group, and Peter smiled gratefully at the man, before returning his attention to the still seething Dakota. Peter patted her on the shoulder and the woman took a few deep breaths before smiling at the teen. The rest of the world isn't like that, kid, Cotus said comfortingly. Peter leaned forward to press a kiss onto her cheek. He congratulated her one final time before returning to where Isabel was now regaling the group of students with information about her work. The group was just getting ready to move to where Zack was working when the doors to the lab opened and a high-pitched beeping was heard, followed by heavy footfalls. Sorry, Pete. He wouldn't take no for an answer once he found out you were in the building, Rhodey said as he followed BB-8 into the lab. The droid rolled straight over to Peter, and the teen dropped to rub the droid's belly. Ned squeaked excitedly and joined his friend on the floor. It's all right, Uncle Rhodey. I wanted to show him off to Ned anyway, Peter replied. Did you make him, Peter? Betty asked as she joined her boyfriend and his friend in patting the droid. Probably bought him, Flash sneered, but Peter just shot the bully a glare. He and Tony built him, Rhodey butted in proudly. Well, mostly Pete. Tony just helped at the end of the process. That's so cool, Peter, Cindy said, and Peter smiled. The other gathered teens all began to chatter excitedly about the droid, and Rhodey was pleased that his nephew was receiving well-deserved praise. Since I'm here, I might as well sing his praises some more, Rhodey said, and Peter blushed. He has been helping Tony with my legs, which are working so much better since Peter got his tools onto them. Once he had sufficiently embarrassed his nephew, Rhodey bid the group his farewells, taking BB-8 with him back up to Tony's lab. The man in question was watching the group's proceedings from his tablet and smiling at Rhodey as he ended. Well done, Tony said to his friend, and the man nodded. They had made the plan that the Avengers would make it known to everyone and their dog that Peter was loved and respected by some of the world's greatest superheroes. Rhodey had jumped at the prospect of flaunting his nephew's brilliance to the teens that had been bullying him. It was easy. He seems okay. He probably has no idea what's coming his way, though, Rhodey said, and Tony just shrugged. Rhodey rolled his eyes and left the lab, Tony's attention returning to the tablet. The field trip group finished up in the science children lab, and Ari began to lead them to the main chemistry labs. As they passed one, Dr. Banner emerged from his labs and walked straight into the group. Sorry, Bruce said, taking off the glasses off his face. Once he realised who he had ran into, he looked around until he found Peter. Pete, I took your experiment off the heat a minute ago. I followed the instructions you left, so hopefully it's all good. Thanks, Uncle B, Peter replied, no longer caring if his peers overheard his names for the Avengers. He loved them, and he didn't care who knew it. Also, your Mama Spider told me to tell you she's expecting you in the studio after your trip today, Bruce continued, and Peter nodded. Bruce nodded at the group and returned to his lab. Seriously, how many of them will we be running into today? MJ asked with a smirk. Knowing that lot, probably all of them, Peter replied as Ari continued to lead the group to the next lab. They're proving a point. Before they could enter the lab, Peter's spidey sense flared again, and he heard Ned gasp excitedly as an animatronic arm wrapped around Peter's shoulders. The teen grinned up at Nebula, who leaned down and pressed a quick, almost imperceptible kiss onto his head. How's your arm? Peter asked, and Nebula flexed her fingers. I prefer it when you work on it, but Papa Stark will do in a pinch, Nebula replied before turning to Ned. You must be Ned and MJ. Peter speaks of you both frequently. Ned was openly gaping at the Lothamoid, and MJ just rolled her eyes before waving at the woman. Nebula waved back, and Peter watched as a scowl crossed her features once the other teenagers had begun to notice her. You know this would happen, Peter teased fondly, and Nebula rolled her eyes at him. Hi, Nebula, Ari said, familiar with the Luffamoid due to her being Peter's constant shadow. What are you? Ned blurted out without tact, and Peter and his friends groaned. Nebula stared at the team and Flash tried to backtrack. I just mean, like, what the hell happened to you? My father tore me apart, piece by piece, whenever I lost a fight to my sister. Nebula replied dryly, and Peter muffled a snicker. He replaced each part with a cybernetic part so that I would be better. That was all he wanted. Perfection. That is what happened to me. Flash backed away slowly, and Peter watched as Nebula smirked proudly. Normally he'd be telling her off for scaring people, but this time he'd let it slide. Nebula sneered at the retreating kid one final time before returning her attention to Betty, who was now asking her a question. I am so glad I volunteered to lead this trip, Ari said as she sidled up beside Peter. Peter looked up at the woman and Ari laughed. If this is the start, I can only imagine what's coming your way, kid. After Nebula answered a few questions, she walked back over to Peter and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Understanding her non-verbal cue, Ari got the group's attention and led them into the next lab. Mr. Parker, I'm going to need you to pay attention, Mr. Phillips said, obviously not realizing that Nebula was projecting a noticeable fade of annoyance in his direction. Phillips looked the Luffamoid up and down before returning his gaze to Peter. Your friend will need to leave. I'm not leaving his side, Nebula hissed, her hand going to her waist. Peter grabbed her wrist, knowing that she was aiming for one of her hidden daggers. Nebs, seriously, I'm all right, Peter said. Nebula looked down at him and frowned. Seriously, this tour is probably not going to be all that fun for you. Why don't you go and hang out in my lab? I'll come up after the tour. Besides, Helix is probably lonely. Nebula nodded after a moment and squeezed Peter's hand before turning on her heel and walking out of the room. Mr. Phillips shot Peter a look full of contempt before returning back to the group. Peter caught up to his friends and smiled as Ned squeezed his arm gently. The labs they visited were interesting enough. Peter spent most of his time being pulled to the side by different interns, much to Mr. Phillips' annoyance. After they visited the third lab, Ari led the group to the elevator and shot them all a bright smile. Alright guys, it is now time for some lunch. We will go to the cafeteria and you will have your choice of around 20 different restaurants, Ari said. The group climbed into the elevator and Friday instantly began to move them. Now, the $15 are all contributed to the trip have been added to your cards for you to use for food. Of course, you can order more than $15 worth, but you will be required to pay the difference. The group disembarked from the elevator and Ari led them down to the cafeteria. All the teenagers, besides Peter of course, stared at all the options before them in awe. We have 45 minutes here, Ari said. She then made them a shooing gesture with her hands. Go, be free! Meet me back here in 45 minutes. The group split off eagerly and Peter led Ned and MJ over to his favourite restaurant in the cafeteria. Once the three teens had ordered, they moved to the side to wait for their meals. Every so often, an intern or office worker would notice Peter and wave at him or say hello, but for most of the time he and his friends were left alone. The trio received their food and walked over to an empty table. They had just started eating when Flash noisily joined them. Peter tried to suppress a groan, but obviously failed when Flash glared at him. I don't know what you did, Parker, but this charade needs to end, Flash growled, drawing the attention of some of the other students on the trip. Most of them had come to the realization that Peter had not in fact been lying. If Friday greeted him when they entered the building hadn't been enough, the way the scientists were addressing him and referencing his work cemented the knowledge that Peter Parker did intern at Stark Industries. The only ones still not convinced, or ignoring the obvious, were Flash and Mr. Phillips. Seriously, Flash? MJ hissed, and the teen turned to the girl. We are simply trying to eat our lunch in peace. Just piss off. Sure, stand up for the pathetic orphan as much as you want, Flash hissed, and Peter tensed. But we all know he's completely full of shit. This is just him trying to get attention and sympathy for the fact that he's a walking curse. Betty and Cindy both gasped as the words left Flash's mouth, and the other students who had overheard the comments began to murmur under their breaths. MJ was practically vibrating in anger, while Ned was attempting to console the now pale Peter. Just as MJ was gearing up to argue, heavy footfalls sounded behind them, and the group gasped loudly as a shadow fell over Flash. "What the hell did you just say?" A deep voice hissed from behind Flash, and the teen turned, an insult on his lips. The insult soon turned into a squeak as he realized that standing above him was James Buchanan Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier. The man had fixed him with such an intense glare that Flash felt himself beginning to shake. "I'd answer him," another voice hissed, and the group didn't know where to look. Standing beside Bucky was Loki, and his glare was just as intense as Bucky's. "He asked you what the hell you just said to Peter. And understand that if we don't like the answer, there will be consequences." "No, there won't," Peter replied, jumping to his bully's defense. MJ rolled her eyes and Peter stood up on Flash's behalf and shared a look with Ned. Peter, on the other side of the table, rested a hand on Bucky's metal arm. "Uncle Wolf, please. He isn't worth it." "Peter," Bucky hissed, his eyes softening slightly as he looked at the team, then asked in Russian, "How long has this been going on for?" When Peter didn't answer immediately, Bucky let out a snarl and turned to glare back onto Flash. Peter pushed him back gently and then rested a hand on Loki's arm as well. "Seriously, guys, I'm all right," Peter said, and both men frowned heavily. The teen noticed both men's eyes roaming his body, no doubt trying to find any marks or bruises caused by the bully. When they found none, Bucky stepped forward and placed both his hands on Peter's shoulders. "The others will hear about this," Bucky said, and Loki nodded. "And I can't imagine Val, Carol, or your Mama Spider will be pleased to hear what's happened here." "Not to mention my brother and the witch," Loki said, and Peter paled. Loki turned to Flash and smirked as he noticed the boy was trembling. "We will be watching you. If we see something we don't like, rest assured we will be back." The two men left the cafeteria, and Flash sat silently returned to where his friends were sitting. The rest of the group dispersed slowly, each teenager shooting glances at Peter as they went. Peter and his friends resumed eating, and while Ned and MJ chatted, Peter remained silent. At the 30-minute mark of lunch, Mr. Phillips approached Peter's table and put his hands on his hips. "Mr. Parker," Mr. Phillips said, and Peter raised his head to his teacher. "I must say, I am not amused by the display we witnessed a few minutes ago. Consider this your second warning." Ned and MJ spluttered out protests, but Peter just resignedly waved them off. He nodded in acquiescence of his teacher's words, before returning to what was left of his milkshake. "Peter, this is ridiculous," MJ commented, and Ned nodded. "Why do you put up with this? From both of them?" "It isn't worth the argument," Peter replied, and both of his friends shook their heads at him. As lunch ended, the group gathered by the doors, and Peter looked over at Ari. Instead of seeing her cheery smile, her face was as dark as a thundercloud. A shiver ripped down his spine, and Peter tensed. "All right, guys. We've had a slight change of plans to this afternoon's itinerary," Ari said, and Peter's heart dropped while his classmates chatted excitedly. "You've been granted a privilege not usually allowed to tour groups. So, let's go." As they walked towards the elevator, Peter looked up at one of Friday's cameras and frowned. "Traitor," he muttered under his breath, and the group looked up as the lights flashed briefly. The group climbed into the service elevator. Ned and MJ formed a barricade between Peter and Flash as the elevator climbed. Ari led the group out of the lift and towards the closed door before turning to face them. "Pete, I'm going to need you to scan us all in," Ari said pointedly, and the whole group turned to face him. "Your badge is the only one with access." "Traitor," Peter muttered again as he stepped forward and swiped his badge over the scanner. The doors opened to the Avengers gym, and Peter let out a barely audible groan. Really? Shit, man. Sam, Wanda, Steve, Bucky, Shuri, Agagaye, and Nat were all standing in the middle of the room, their gazes locked onto the teenagers entering the gym. Peter looked up at the cameras again and shook his head firmly. Tattletale, Peter murmured, knowing that Friday could hear him. Ari led the group towards the Avengers, and Peter felt his heart drop once again. This wouldn't be pleasant. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed this. Good to have this author back. Absolutely love it to pieces. Or him, whatever, non-binary, I don't care. Anyway, yeah, I'm looking forward to the next chapter. This is going to be so much fun. All of the Avengers, one by one, just coming in, singing Peter's praises and everything. It's great. Nebula being the overprotective big sister and happy. And I honestly want to punch Mr. Phillips. I normally respect teachers, but good lord. And Bucky and Loki giving Flash a 3rd degree. This is going to be sweet. I don't normally like it when adults target teenagers, but retribution for bullies is something I will never regret interacting with. So yeah, remember to like, comment and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye.